Welcome, everybody, to Provoke Media's new podcast series. We're going to be talking over the next few months and hopefully years to the CEOs of some of the world's biggest and some of the world's best public relations agencies, taking them through the development of their agencies, the evolution of the business, and what they see in the future. And we really couldn't start a series like this with anybody other than Richard Edelman. Not only is Edelman still, I think, the world's largest public relations agency, it's a bastion of independence in an ocean of holding companies. It is a thought leader in areas like trust, which are increasingly central to our business. And not only that, but Richard and I go back almost 40 years. And I wanted to start sort of 40 years ago because I came into the business while your father, Dan, was still in charge at Edelman and saw the evolution of the firm over the next 4 or 5 years. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about sort of the business as it was when you came into it and when you took it over.
So I came into Edelman in 1978 and we were $6 million in revenue. And I took over the firm in 1996 and we were $85 million in revenue. And today we're around $1 billion in revenue. And so it's been 28 years for me in CEO. And the firm's become more global. I think we've become much, much more corporate as well as being strong in brand. We've diversified into digital. We've built a very strong creative business. And trust has been a central plank of our program.
Right. So I don't know if you remember this, but I do quite vividly. That when I first arrived in the States in 1987, about a year after that, we published our first ever agency report card. We issued reports on the 30 or so biggest agencies in the US. And I think it's fair to say that we were not particularly kind to Edelman. And we were not kind to a lot of people. And some of them tried to get us shut down at the time. I remember the CEO of one major agency, I won't name it, it rhymes with Bill and Bolton, came into our office and tried to persuade people that we should no longer exist because we'd been so unkind. And the thing that I always remember is that while everybody was ranting and raving about poor reviews, you invited me to come in and sit down and talk to you about what I was hearing in the marketplace and what the marketplace thought were the issues with Edelman. And it was by far the most mature response that I got to that report card. But I think it's fair to say that in those days, there was an interesting culture, let's put it like that, that you've since moved away from. But tell me a little bit about the cultural evolution over the years.
I think that in my father's tenure, we had a very brand-oriented business. We had a lot of turnover of clients and people. And we were a classic kind of entrepreneurial company with all the good things, but some of the bad things. Yeah. And some part of it was charming. He'd go to a PR conference and meet someone from Germany, and the wall had just gone down and said, well, we have an office in Berlin. And that was deeply entrepreneurial and quite foresighted, and sometimes ahead of its time. But what I took from your critique was we had to institute a quality program, and that we had to make sure that clients that were in the house were grown and tended and given the best service, and without losing that edge.
Great. How much did your management education play into sort of taking Edelman from that very sort of improvisational style to, I mean, you're still highly entrepreneurial, but I think there's a little more structure and discipline now than there was back then.
Well, I think it was clear to me that we had to globalize, that we had to be more balanced between corporate and brand, that we needed to have growth engines as products. So for instance, if digital was starting to work, feed the beast. And that we needed to, at some point, recognize that we were competing more broadly than against our fellow PR firms, that we can compete with ad agencies or digital firms, that in fact, if PR budgets were only 5% of total spend, we had to get to the other 95. And so the market has fundamentally evolved so that we're now competing against the outgrowth of the financial PR firms, the Teneos, Brunswicks, et cetera. We're competing against management consultancies in some cases. We're competing against ad agencies, as well as our classic PR firms.
Right. We'll talk a little bit about that going forward, because obviously that's where the market is headed. The competitive landscape is very different now than it was when we first met. But I'm interested too in the evolution of your attitude towards independence, because in the 30, 40 years that we've known each other, I think there have been 2 or 3 different times where the market assumed that Edelman would join the parade of agencies that had been subsumed into Omnicom, into Public, WPP. I'm sure you've been approached by almost everybody. How much has your commitment to independence wavered and strengthened?
Well, I would say it's only strengthened because what I've observed is that formerly great agencies under the holding company umbrellas have been weakened and in some cases done away with. And I think that is indicative of PR as a support element in holding companies. It's not the lead driver of strategy, where for us, we are broadening our reach and our approach so that we're beyond PR. We're in other categories, digital, et cetera. And yet, our whole theory of trust drives growth and action earns trust is an earned idea. And the same around earned creative tied into creator economy. It's all premised on PR thinking. And I think we're the only ones of scale that have that ability to be, our dream is to be a full solution as opposed to being just a wing of an army that has a different general.
So you've already alluded to, I think, the 2 big sort of trends that I've seen in the years we've known each other and that I think are going to continue into the future. The first is this move towards, and I wish I could come up with a better word than integrated, because
Yes.
I don't feel like integrated is sufficient. But a multi-channel, multimedia, peso model with public relations at the heart.
Yeah.
But a ton of content creation that spans every channel. And that has involved bringing in more creatives, more data and analytics
Yes.
people, people with very specific skills that have nothing to do with talking to reporters or getting media coverage. And so you've very much been investing in that for the last decade or so. Tell me a little bit about sort of what that model looks like and what you've seen work and what you've seen maybe that you had to rethink or step back from.
I clearly saw that the legacy media was going to have an economic problem, that local newspapers were going to be winnowed, that local broadcast was going to shrink. That was the whole premise of Edelman. You know, you'll remember that my dad did media tours and served stories up to those media outlets all over the U.S. and then all over the world. And, you know, so...
And anybody who's listening who's never heard of the Tony twins should do a little Google search after we've finished.
Yeah, 7 sets of twins going to different parts of the country and with a trailer with their clothes in it and visiting radio stations and TV stations. But the question then became, if you have a shrinking media environment, how do you grow it? And so we were very early in our own content creation through, you know, for having social channels for brands, and very early in also identifying influencers who then became content creators. And so we've just shifted our focus from classic reporters to new reporters.
So is what's happening now a continuation of that trend? Because from my perspective, it feels different, right? We've seen the Washington Post lost 250,000 subscribers overnight, and a ton of journalistic talent. Jen Rubin just went out to start her own, The Contrarian, and you know, there's a massive drain of talent from the Washington Post. CNN and MSNBC saw their viewing ratings crater in the last few months. And we now have a position where CEOs would rather go on Joe Rogan than talk to a mainstream journalist. I saw the mainstream media referred to on Blue Sky a couple of weeks ago as the zombie media. This idea that, you know, they're at this point, the Post and the Times are dead men walking. Is that, first of all, is that overstated? Second of all, is it just a continuation of the trend that you've been seeing for the last few years, or is it something really different?
Paul, I don't think it's either or. I think it's and. It's true that some of the mainstream media, CNN, Washington Post, have had winnowing audience. And at the same time, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the FT have record subscriptions, a lot of them digital, not print. But I believe there's still huge power in the mainstream media, and a placement again in the Wall Street Journal is hugely important. At the same time, there's a problem of dispersion of authority. And so I don't believe you have to start with an interview in Bloomberg. You now can start with a small piece in Axios, and then it goes into a podcaster, and then so your media array is much broader. And I also believe, though, with the changes in Meta last week, that there has to be a lower bar for intervention by PR teams. We've got to be much more 24/7 watching and saying, this has the potential to spiral. We have to intervene with facts. I mean, with the change in the media environment, I think all of business, government, NGOs need to speak up more and more quickly and continuously, because disinformation is the threat to society. If we don't have agreed facts, we don't have consistent decisions. And all of this is being cheered on in Beijing and in Moscow, actually. So, you know, again, it's our job to have clarity. And again, I think it's also our job in PR. We are the first draft of history now. We no longer have a Paul Holmes as a journalist to evaluate whether or not this pitch is fake. We have to decide that ourselves, and we have to be much harder with our clients and say, "That you prove it, show us."
But we also have a huge segment of the public that is enthusiastic about celebrating the fake. Because we talk all the time about disinformation as if it's purely a supply problem, but it's also a demand problem.
No, it's
you
like
can see with
fentanyl.
what's going on right now with the wildfires in California, that there are people who are seeking out and eating up disinformation at a rate that 10 years ago I would have thought would be unimaginable.
But you and I talked 15 years ago about Oh My News in Korea and the possibility of citizen journalism and all of this being very positive. And it is in a certain way, but properly done. Right. And if people are trying to make political points by fake news, this is destructive of the system.
Right.
And one of the findings that most scares me in the 2025 Edelman Trust Barometer is the loss of belief in capitalism.
Right.
And people don't think the system works.
So the other big trend that I wanted to talk about, which will lead us, I think, into the Trust Barometer and the declining trust in capitalism and the rise of populism, which is not quite the same thing, is the increased emphasis, I think, on C-suite counsel. So at the same time that there's an element of our business that is going through a crisis of confidence, what does it mean to be an earned first agency in an era where traditional earned media are collapsing? There is a segment of our business that is being called upon to answer bigger, more important mission-critical questions than ever before. It's, we can discuss when it started, but for me, it reached a zenith with Russia. And public relations people were being asked not just what do we say about Russia, but what do we do about Russia? Do we stay there and ride it out and accept the reputation risk, or do we pull back? And that was a massive business decision.
You'll remember that I'm officially banned by the Russian Federation.
Congratulations.
Yes, along with Catherine St. Pierre.
We can talk afterwards about how I can get officially banned by the Russian Federation. But the C-suite question, there's no doubt that at the top end of our business, right? Look at the money that KKR spent on FGS. At the top end of our business, what we do is more important and more valuable than it's ever been. And is that a recognition from CEOs that this stuff matters?
It matters deeply. And I think the mistake would be to say, CEOs, stick your head down and this age of grievance will just pass. And I think CEOs should focus on the areas in which their businesses can make an impact. That it's good for their business, but affordable products, good wages, reskilling, all straight business topics. This is not something that right or left is going to criticize. It is an important, business is the most trusted, it is the most competent, it's the most ethical institution, and should use its position as such to make a advance for society. Right. It's not a bad thing to have society function well. That's what we should want. But Paul, the issues are complicated, because now you've got much more geopolitical strife. You have mass class divides. You have battle for truth. So CEOs have to choose. They can't be the overall solve. Government's got to stand up and do better. There's no question.
Now, last year in Davos, one of the big themes that came out of the meeting was the concern that business leaders had about the level of political instability that they were already experiencing, and the potential with so many elections last year for the political instability to become even more of a problem. And I would argue that whatever your worst fears are, they've almost certainly been realized, if not exceeded, over the last 12 months. Now, you're unveiling a new Trust Barometer in Davos in a few days. If I promise that this podcast won't go live until after the unveiling of the research. Maybe we can talk about some of the interesting findings.
Of course.
Because, as I said to you at the beginning, before we got on air, it feels to me like business is at least feeling as though it's a zero-sum game. That if they do anything that the left approves of, the right will counterattack. If they do anything to appease the right, the left will bitch and moan. What are you seeing in the Trust Barometer data, and how does it help you steer some sort of middle path?
So let's start with the idea that we've entered a new phase, that we've gone from fears, which is in a certain way passive, to polarization, which is political, to grievance, which is aggressive. And 60+% of respondents say they're discriminated against. 50% of American whites. And we also see deep grievance in markets like Germany. A third of the people deeply aggrieved. And you've seen this in the change in elections. Incumbents have been thrown out in the UK, in the US, in Canada, in Germany, in France, et cetera. And so,
I mean, when you have billionaires and multi-billionaires and half-trillionaires who feel like they're being oppressed, it's not particularly surprising if you also have a vast number of ordinary people who feel that way. Grievance has become an industry.
Well, grievance has become universal. And it's across gender, it's across age group, it's across income group, it's across ethnic group. It's quite stunning. So what is the origin of grievance? Well, it's mass class divide. It's this battle for truth. It's definitely a sense that the system doesn't work for me. Paul, there's not a single Western democracy where the respondents believe that they'll be better off in the next generation, more than 30%. The U.S. is at the high at 30%. France is 9%. Japan is 10%. So it's quite dire. And again, it's the average age of a person buying a house in the U.S. is now 49 years old. It used to be when you moved to the States, you could buy a house for, whatever is a couple $100,000 and start and get into it. Not now, it's too expensive. So what we need to do is we need to restore a belief in economics and in economic optimism and in the capitalist system like this. If we restore belief in institutions, people interestingly have economic optimism. If you have low belief in institutions, you have low belief in the future of your economic outcome. So how does this work? Well, business has to play its role, which is economic engine, innovation, affordable prices, all this stuff. But government has to deliver for me. That's what people see. Government is too biased to wealthy, et cetera. Government deliver for me. NGOs, this is fascinating, have a new role, which is the healer and the unifying force for the highly aggrieved. We haven't seen this for 20 years. This has been sort of the origins of the Trust Barometer, where we saw NGOs as the force on sustainability or human rights, et cetera. All of a sudden, NGOs are rediscovered. And then media is the fulcrum. Because if we don't have agreed facts and have media come back to the middle as a core business model and support the media through contributions by business, government, NGOs into the bloodstream with quality content, we'll never get to a good place.
Okay. I mean, correct me if I'm misinterpreting the data, because you've seen it and I'm just hearing about it. But it sounds to me as if inequality, and particularly sort of unfairness, is going to be one of the dominating issues of the next few years, that people need to feel that the structures around them are giving them a fair shot. And I could probably construct a case that business is the best equipped to help with that, but I could also create, because this is the way my mind works, an equally compelling case that it's the worst equipped to deal with that capitalism generally doesn't concern itself with issues of equality. How does business get involved with that problem, again, without pissing off half the world?
So you have people on both left and right irritated with the system. And that's why business has a parlous course here, because it's trying to navigate as Odysseus through Scylla and Charybdis. And you're, trying to not be sucked into the whirlpool or captured by the dragon. But the reality for a CEO is you have the ultimate success story if we can get people reskilled, good jobs, pay them well, make them calm, make them feel as if they can get ahead, that there is a bright future. And I believe in AI. Brad Smith wrote a really terrific piece that I urge you to read. And he said, it has to be multi-sectoral. I believe in AI for health and all this stuff. But Paul, our research in Trust shows something like 1/5 of people believe in AI. If you're highly aggrieved, you're totally against AI. Right. Why? Because you think of it as like globalization, and that it will ruin your job prospect.
I was just going to say that we've talked for 30 or 40 minutes and we haven't mentioned AI, so I'm glad you brought it up.
Yes.
Are we going to be able to persuade people that that's part of the solution, or are they going to continue to see it, as you just described, as part of the problem?
Well, again, if we keep it as a mystery and it's being developed at OpenAI and in a quiet way in which people get even wealthier, this is a doom.
Right now, it's a black box for tech bros, right?
It must not be. It must be, hey, the Edelman family has a predisposition to this kind of disease, and we're going to be able to intervene in advance. And by the way, instead of taking months to look at these clinical trials, we can get down to these 3 drugs that show the most promise in weeks and get you the right solutions. We have to let people in on the secret, and this is a key part of the PR business in the next decade. The how, the why, the fairness, the pricing, all of which needs to be explained. If you look at our study for last year for Trust, the rejection of innovation was shocking. That, for example, biotech, the Monsanto, et cetera, that's like 5 to 1 against. If AI is sort of in the middle, but it could go the other way. It could be very positive or very negative. The idea of making this more than a black box, of letting you in as a partner, listening to people's concerns. Very important, this empathy part. One other thing I want to talk about, Paul. We still are living through the effects of COVID.
Right.
And I don't mean health effects. I mean mental health. Mm-hmm. I mean the destruction of belief and expertise, the antipathy to government, the idea somehow that people profited, the rich profited, we need a reckoning. We need an understanding. I know the UK government is actually doing a formal investigation of this for the 5th anniversary. Bravo. We need to do this in the States and in some other countries.
Truth and reconciliation.
Well, again, when you think of other disasters, 9/11 and others, and you were in the States in 9/11, mm-hmm. I mean, what was the intelligence failure? How did we fix this? Et cetera. All of this has to come out. And also, and this is another small hobby horse, we got to get people out of their homes. This idea that you're better off just being on social and streaming and being remote, and it's ridiculous. Human beings are inherently better when they're together.
Okay, let me wrap up because I think we're close to our time limit here with a couple of questions about the competitive landscape.
Of course.
The end of last year was interesting. It was bookended by 2 fairly seismic events in the PR business: the merger of Burson and Hill and Knowlton, possibly the 2 most august brands. Yeah. Their behemoth status predated yours. Coming together, and then the end of the year saw the merger of Omnicom and Interpublic, which puts 5, 6 global PR agency brands under a single umbrella. How do you view the impact of those changes on our business and your business?
So I think the general view is rationalization and cost cutting, and it's not a bright picture. It is what commercial banks did in merging and reducing overheads and cutting offices. And I want to pursue a very different course. You know me, I like to run the pirate ship, and I go the different way. And I believe and also today's news that Publicis and Leo Burnett are merging, and the name Burnett's going away. It's going to be called Leo.
Yeah.
And, I'm from Chicago. That's like, I don't know, eliminating Michigan Avenue. But it's, I want to be counter-trend at Edelman. I think that there's a really important opportunity.
Okay. We should, I think, because I would be committing journalistic malpractice if I didn't mention it, bring up the fact that you, in fact, consolidated a couple of months ago, and that there were layoffs at a scale that the industry certainly paid attention to.
Yeah.
You see that as different from what you're seeing at Burson and Hill and Knowlton and potentially at the other holding companies?
I think we had the mistaken notion that we were better served to have a main brand and then a lot of small brands in specialist areas. And what people really wanted to buy was Edelman. They want Edelman to be dimensional as opposed to us trying to compete as a bunch of boutiques.
Right.
That was our lesson out of this. And we should just be able to bring the best of all of Edelman to client assignments, whether it's employee engagement or financial or crisis or whatever, or digital.
Right.
And so that's how we're best.
I mean, that makes sense to me in that there are no one-dimensional problems anymore, right? I mean, you may be thinking about sort of how do I unlock shareholder value, but part of the answer to that might, in fact, be influencer marketing. And the ability to bring all that together,
brands and politics,
core strength of our business.
Brands and public affairs, for instance. It's not something you'd have thought of 2 or 3 years ago, but all of a sudden it's quite intruded. And therefore it's a positive for us. The more complicated, the better we should do. And the other thing that's huge advantage for us is we're in 60 cities. We're keeping our global network intact and in flags, because we want to be able to be everywhere and have those kinds of inputs into our creative solutions.
So I know the answer to this question, but I have to ask it to wrap things up. You're bullish, despite everything, on the future of public relations and the future of Edelman?
I'm completely bullish. I think AI is a great enhancer of our abilities. It's going to make us able to create content as fast and even better than the ad agencies, because people don't want 30-second spots. They want things that they have some input to, and they want to feel as if they're part of. I also believe that counseling on political matters or socioeconomic matters. And lastly, that the best PR is based on actions. And the work we did, for instance, with DP World last year on the, move to -15 and changing refrigeration holds, or IKEA on secondhand tax, or things like this. Those are so important, and that's how PR people think. How can we change the game? How can we fix things? How can we make it better? We're not here to just entertain you or grab your attention. We're kind of a more serious partner, and I like that, and I think it's our key advantage.
Yeah, for me historically that we've been at our best when we've been solving big problems.
Yeah,
so that's great. Thank you, Richard. That's a great way to kick off a series. I appreciate your time. I look forward to seeing you in a few days in Davos.
You shall indeed, and let's go Mets.
All right. Thanks.